welcome back. Tonight's next part of Fiddler on the Roof opens with choices pressing in from every side. I'll keep the pace slow and steady while we return to Anatevka at first light, where promises, proposals, and providence all weigh on a father's heart. Settle in, breathe, and let me read you gently towards sleep. Chapter 2. The Weight of Providence. The weeks that followed, Lazar Wolf's proposal hung over our household, like the clouds that gathered each afternoon over Anatevka, heavy with rain that might or might not fall, keeping everyone in a state of suspended anticipation. I had asked the butcher for time to consider, a request he had granted with the grudging patience of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, but understanding that in matters of marriage, even his substantial influence had its limits. During those weeks, I observed my eldest daughter with the intensity of a scholar, studying a difficult text, looking for signs, portents, some indication of what dwelt in her heart. Tzeitel went about her daily routines with her customary grace, helping her mother with the household duties, teaching her younger sisters their letters, working at her loom with fingers that never seemed to tire. But there was something else there too, a quality of waiting that matched my own. Motel's visits had become even more frequent, though his pretexts had paradoxically become more elaborate, as though the transparency of his simple excuses had finally become apparent even to him. One day, it was a theological question about whether a torn prayer shawl could be mended on the Sabbath if it was the only one available, a question to which we both knew the answer. Another day, he brought a book he thought I might find interesting, though the book was in Hebrew so archaic that neither of us could make much sense of it, leading to an afternoon of pleasant puzzlement that served no purpose except to keep him in our house and in Tzeitel's presence. "That boy spends more time here than at his own shop," Golda observed one evening as we prepared for bed, her tone carefully neutral in that way that meant she was anything but neutral. "His customers must wonder if he's abandoned the tailoring trade altogether." "He's dedicated to his craft," I replied, though we both knew his dedication had little to do with needle and thread. "Speaking of which, this shirt seems to have developed another hole. Perhaps I should ask him to—" "Don't you dare," Golda interrupted, but there was amusement in her voice. "That shirt has more patches than original cloth as it is. Any more of Motel's attention, and it will be entirely his creation." We lay in the darkness, the familiar sounds of our sleeping household around us. Sprintzu's gentle snoring, Bielku's occasional mumbling, the settling of the house itself as it adjusted to the cool of night. These were the sounds that had accompanied our nights for years, the rhythm of family life that was as essential to our existence as breath itself. "Tevye," Golda said into the darkness, "what will you tell Lazar?" "I don't know," I admitted, though I had been thinking of little else. Every time I decide one way, my mind immediately presents me with arguments for the other. It's like being my own opposing counsel in a trial where I'm also the judge and the accused. "And Tzeitel? Have you spoken to her?" "How can I? If I ask her directly, I put her in an impossible position. To refuse a match her father has arranged would be to go against tradition, against me, against everything she's been taught. But to accept would be to condemn herself to a life without love," Golda finished. "You speak as though love were bread, essential for life," I said, though without conviction. "Isn't it?" she asked, and in the darkness I could feel her turn toward me. Tevye, do you remember when we were first married? How strange it was, two strangers trying to make a life together. But we were fortunate. We found comfort in each other. Perhaps even more than comfort. Not everyone is so lucky. It was the closest she had ever come to a declaration of love, and it moved me more than poetry might have. We had been matched by our parents, had met only 3 times before our wedding, had entered marriage as strangers, bound by tradition and hope. That we had found affection, partnership, even passion, though we would never speak of such things in daylight, was indeed providence. But could one count on providence repeating itself? The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Perchik, the student from Kiev, appeared at our door just as I was preparing to leave for my milk rounds. He stood there in his threadbare coat that had clearly seen better days, possibly better decades, his face bearing that mixture of confidence and hunger that marked young men who lived on ideas rather than food. Reb Tevye, he said, I wonder if I might speak with you about a proposition. If you're selling something, I should warn you that we have nothing to buy it with, I said, though not unkindly. There was something about the young man that appealed to me, perhaps his obvious intelligence, or perhaps simply the fact that he reminded me of myself at that age, full of questions and short on answers. On the contrary, I'm offering something for sale, in a manner of speaking, he replied. I teach, Reb Tevye, mathematics, Russian, history, geography, subjects that could open new worlds for young minds. I thought perhaps your daughters. My daughters know how to read Hebrew and keep accounts, I interrupted. What more does a woman need? With respect, Perchik said, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. The world is changing. The old barriers are breaking down. In Kiev, in Petersburg, there are women attending universities, women becoming doctors, teachers, even lawyers. Knowledge is no longer the exclusive province of men. And you think my daughters should become lawyers? I asked, amused despite myself at the image of Hodel arguing cases before a judge. I think your daughters should have choices, he replied simply. The word hung between us, like a challenge. Choices. It was what I was struggling with regarding Tzeitel, the burden and the gift of choice. For generations, our choices had been made for us, by tradition, by our parents, by the circumstances of our birth. Now this young revolutionary was suggesting that we might choose for ourselves, that my daughters might choose for themselves. I have no money for such lessons, I said, which was true, but also an evasion. I would teach in exchange for board, Perchik offered quickly, as though he had anticipated this objection. Just meals, not lodging. I have a room at Reb Mordecai's. I studied him more carefully. His hunger was evident, not just in his thin frame, but in his eyes, which held the kind of appetite that food alone could never satisfy. He was hungry for purpose, for connection, for the chance to matter in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to young men with more intelligence than resources. I'll discuss it with my wife, I said finally, which was my standard response to any proposition that required actual decision. Come back tomorrow. As he walked away, I found myself thinking about choices and changes, about the world beyond Anatevka that was apparently offering opportunities we had never imagined. But with opportunity came danger, the danger of losing oneself in the vastness of possibility, of abandoning the solid ground of tradition for the uncertain flights of progress. Soon enough, we would learn just how dangerous change could be, though on this peaceful morning, We had no inkling of the storms that would come with the refugees from Zhytomyr. My milk rounds that day took me to the Russian section of the village, where the houses were marginally larger and the streets marginally cleaner, as though prosperity itself provided a shield against mud and decay. My customers there always paid promptly, but rarely spoke beyond the necessary exchanges, maintaining a distance that was both physical and metaphysical, as though too much contact with a Jew might be contaminating. It was there, at the home of Fyodor Petrovitch, the constable, that I encountered an unexpected scene. A small crowd had gathered in his courtyard, and at its center stood Perchik, engaged in animated discussion with several young Russians, including, to my considerable surprise, Fyodor's own son, Sasha. The writings of Gorky are not just literature, Perchik was saying, his voice carrying the passion of true belief. They are a mirror held up to society, showing us not just what we are, but what we might become. Dangerous talk, one of the older Russians muttered, but Sasha leaned forward with obvious interest. Dangerous to whom? Perchik challenged. To those who benefit from the current order, perhaps. But what about those who suffer under it? What about the workers who labor 14 hours a day for kopecks? What about... He caught sight of me and paused. What about honest milkmen who can barely feed their families despite working from dawn to dusk? Several heads turned in my direction, and I felt the uncomfortable sensation of being transformed from person to symbol, from Tevye the milkman to the Jewish question personified. I quickly completed my delivery and departed, but not before catching a glimpse of something in young Sasha's face that troubled me. Not the usual contempt or indifference I was accustomed to, but something more complex, as though he were seeing me for the first time, as something other than a feature of the landscape. That evening, as our family gathered for dinner, I recounted Perchik's proposition to Golda, though I left out the scene at the constable's house. The reaction from our daughters was immediate and varied. Russian? Hodel's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that immediately made me suspicious. To read Russian books in the original? Mathematics, Kava added with quiet interest. Real mathematics, not just household accounts. Why would we need such things? Tzeitel asked, ever practical, though I noticed she was looking at her younger sisters with something like envy. Because, Hodel said with the certainty of 17 years, the world is larger than Anatevka, and we should know something about it. The world may be larger, Golda interjected, but we live in Anatevka. Will knowing Russian help you make better chala? Will mathematics make you a better wife? Perhaps, Sprintzu suggested thoughtfully. It will make us better people. We all turned to look at her, surprised by this philosophical contribution from a 12-year-old who usually concerned herself primarily with ribbons and gossip. Out of the mouths of babes, I muttered, then louder, we'll try it. For a month, if Perchik proves satisfactory, and if... I looked meaningfully at each of my daughters. If it doesn't interfere with your regular duties, we'll continue. The decision was met with enthusiasm from the younger girls and acceptance from Tzeitel, who seemed to have other matters on her mind. As the meal concluded and the evening prayers were said, I found myself alone with my eldest daughter as she cleared the table. "Papa," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes, "has Lazar Wolf spoken to you?" My heart performed that peculiar acrobatic maneuver again. What makes you ask?" "Yenta was here today," she replied, which explained everything. Yenta, the matchmaker, had sources of information that would make the Tsar's secret police envious. She suggested that I should prepare myself for good news. "And what would you consider good news?" I asked carefully. Tzeitel was quiet for a long moment, her hands busy with the dishes, but her mind clearly elsewhere. When she spoke, it was with a maturity that caught me off guard. "I would consider it good news if my father remembered that his daughter is not just a daughter, but a person, with her own heart and her own hopes." "And what does your heart hope for?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, and in her eyes I saw my mother's strength and my wife's wisdom and something entirely her own, a quiet determination that would not be moved by tradition or convenience or even paternal authority. My heart hopes for a husband who sees me not as a possession to be acquired or a burden to be assumed, but as a partner to walk beside through whatever life may bring. Someone who would choose poverty with me over prosperity without me. Someone who... She stopped herself, color rising to her cheeks. "Someone like Motel," I suggested gently. The dish in her hands clattered to the table, and for a moment she looked genuinely frightened. Then, gathering her courage like a shawl around her shoulders, she nodded. "Someone exactly like Motel." I sat down heavily, feeling the weight of tradition pressing down upon me like the world on Atlas's shoulders. "Tzeitel, Motel is a good boy, man, but he has nothing, less than nothing. He has debts from buying his sewing machine. You would live on air and love alone." "Is that so different from how we live now?" she asked, and there was no bitterness in it, just honest assessment. "Papa, we have never been rich. We have always made do with little, but we have been happy, haven't we? Because we have had each other, because we have had love. Why should I expect more? Why should I settle for less?" Her logic was flawless, which made it all the more troubling. How could I argue against my own life as example? How could I say that the contentment Golda and I had found was not worth seeking, that security was more important than affection, that tradition should override emotion? "Lazar Wolf could give you a good life," I said, but even to my own ears it sounded weak. "He could give me his life," Tzeitel corrected, "already half-lived, with its patterns set and its habits formed. With Motel, we would create our own life, our own patterns, our own traditions even." "Our own traditions," I repeated, and the phrase seemed to contain within it both promise and threat, both evolution and revolution. "Tzeitel, give me time to think." She kissed my forehead, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it nearly undid my composure entirely. "Of course, Papa. But remember, time is one thing neither Motel nor I have in abundance. We are not getting younger, and the world is not standing still." After she left, I sat alone in the gathering darkness, the house settling into its nighttime quietness around me. Through the window, I could see stars beginning to appear, those distant lights that had witnessed every human drama since the beginning of time, and would continue watching long after we were all dust in memory. "Lord," I said quietly, "I asked you for wisdom, and you send me a daughter who argues like a rabbi. I asked you for clarity, and you send me choices that would confound Solomon himself. Is this your idea of help or your idea of humor?" The stars predictably offered no answer, but somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of a fiddle playing, that eternal melody that accompanied our days and nights, our joys and sorrows, our traditions, and our changes. The fiddler on the roof, maintaining his impossible balance, playing his impossible tune, reminding us all that life itself was an act of faith, a dance on the edge of the abyss, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Tomorrow, I would have to give Lazar Wolf an answer. Tomorrow, I would have to choose between tradition and love, between security and happiness, between the world as it had always been and the world as it might become. But tonight, I could sit in the darkness and postpone the inevitable, like a man standing at a crossroads who chooses to rest before taking the path that will determine all his future journeys. The night deepened, and still I sat, wrestling with angels I couldn't see and demons I couldn't name, while above me, on the roof, the fiddler played on, his melody now sad, now joyful, now something beyond either, the music of life itself, complex and contradictory, and absolutely, ineffably beautiful. Thanks for spending some time with me tonight. I hope I helped you unwind and drift a little closer to sleep. If you're enjoying these readings, there's a whole library of full books and cozy chapters waiting for you over on my Patreon. If you are already a member, then I thank you. It includes exclusive content, bonus episodes, and early access to new releases. You can also become a YouTube member if you haven't already, to listen ad-free and explore hundreds of other relaxing readings anytime you like. I'd love to have you there. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next one.